Hi, everyone. My name is Zeke Kimball. I'm the coordinator of research for the ACPA Coalition for Disability, and I would like to thank you for being here with us today. We're really, really happy to have Annemarie Vaccaro joining us today. We'll learn a little bit more about her and her work in just a moment. But first, I just want to say that this is part of a series of research roundtables that we're hoping to do over the course of the upcoming year and moving forward from that point. The goal is really to bring in leading scholars of disability in higher education and to learn a bit more about their work. And as I mentioned, we're really, really pleased and fortunate to have Annemarie Vaccaro with us today. And I'd also like to ask Spencer to introduce himself.
Hi, y'all. My name is Spencer Scruggs, and I am a disability specialist at Florida State University, specifically working in the Student Disability Resource Center. I work to provide academic accommodations to students and work hand in hand with faculty on accommodation concerns and making accessible and inclusive learning environments for students with disabilities. I also serve as the engagement coordinator for the Coalition for Disability, and so that's where sort of my job comes in to help facilitate some of these wonderful opportunities for you to engage in content with others, with the coalition, on topics of disability, ability, and higher education.
Great. And we'd also like to ask everybody who's joining us today to introduce themselves, just so that we can know who's joining us.
So as mentioned before in the chat, how we'll do this is that I have the option of unmuting your microphone, and so once I unmute it, I'll ask you by name to introduce yourself and just give a brief introduction so that we can know who all is on the call.
And specifically, it would be really helpful if you could provide your name, the role that you're presently in, your pronouns, and anything that you find particularly interesting about today's call, stuff that you hope to know.
Dale, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Dale O'Neill. I serve as the Director of Student Involvement at Loyola University New Orleans. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And for me, I am a student affairs practitioner within campus activities. So specifically looking at how I can make our programs more accessible to all students.
Gary, would you like to introduce yourself? Gary?
Yes, hello.
Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm the Accessibility Services Director at NMSU Alamogordo, and is he, she, or he pronouns. And I'm working on my Ph.D. focusing on accessibility services.
Great.
Wonderful. Dr. Evans, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Why do I get to first names? I'm Nancy Evans. I'm a professor emeritus at Iowa State. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I do work in disability research, and I just want to see what Annemarie's up to.
Thank you.
Sheila, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Sheila Judge, and I'm Director of Disability Services at Dillard University in New Orleans. And as I serve the disability population, I'm just always interested in learning more and how to better serve them.
And Sue, would you like to introduce yourself? Sue? Sue? Sue, if you would like, we were having some audio issues, so if you would like to post a brief introduction in the chat feature or share it through a question. Oh, actually, you already did. So, and I will share that with our presenter so that we can get started. So.
All right.
Thank you all for joining.
And I'm going to go ahead and do the kind of formal introduction of Annemarie to tell you a little bit about her that she wouldn't share more than likely. So Annemarie is an associate professor at the University of Rhode Island and the director of the College Student Personnel Program there. Annemarie is the 2017 NASPA George Koo Award winner for Outstanding Contribution to Literature or Research, and was in 2013 recognized by ACPA for her service to the profession for her disability scholarship and research. This is in addition to a slew of other awards that, if I actually read through, we would kind of take up most of our time today. So I'm really pleased to introduce Annemarie and to allow her the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about herself and the work that she does.
Thank you very much, Zeke. Can everybody hear me? I hope. So I'm Annemarie Vaccaro. I'm the program director for the College Student Personnel Master's Program here at the University of Rhode Island. We're a master's only student affairs prep program, and I'm an associate professor. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I have a couple of slides about me, so Spencer's going to have to move them for me though. So Spencer, if you wouldn't mind going to the next one. Maybe. Excellent, thank you. I consider myself a scholar educator. I started my career actually in student affairs, so I do have a student affairs beginning. I worked in residence life, service learning, and living and learning communities. I was a per course instructor for quite a few years, 5 to be specific, which meant I taught introductory courses for first year seminar. I taught some sociology classes, some gender and women's studies classes, and I realized that I loved teaching so much that I was doing almost the equivalent of a full teaching load on top of my regular student affairs job, which some people can't imagine because student affairs job is never a 40-hour-a-week job anyway. But I was loving it. So I was teaching on nights and weekends. And so finally I decided, you know, maybe I should try just being a faculty member. But at that point in my career, I was still afraid of the publish or perish process. That was a little daunting to me. And so I took a position as a clinical professor, which meant that there wasn't this pressure to publish, and it was just kind of a contractual position. And it was a fill-in position for a faculty who had left mid-year. And so I did that at the University of Denver for 1.5 years, and then I realized how much I really did love it. And so I applied for a couple of permanent positions, and I was hired here at the University of Rhode Island in the College Student Personnel Program, and I've been here for 9 years. I earned tenure in 2013, and I am up for full professor this year. So that's a little bit about who I am and what my history is. And Spencer, if you would move the slides. Spencer. All right. Well, I'm gonna start talking about the next slide, and yep, there it is. Thank you. In terms of my research and what I do, I would say the broad umbrella is that I consider myself a person who does social justice and higher education as my research. I try to examine the intersections of student development, identity, and systems of inequality in higher ed. And I've done this through focusing on kind of a couple of different areas. My most recent research I'll talk about in a little bit is on purpose development. I've also studied student sense of belonging in terms of students with disabilities, self-advocacy, and activism. I've also done some work with graduate students and undergraduate students about how they learn about diversity and social justice, what that process looks like, and then a little bit of writing on leadership development. So next slide. I consider myself a critical qualitative scholar, which means I need to kind of situate myself in my work. And so I identify as a queer, woman-identified, white, middle-class, middle-aged, not religious person, and I do not identify as a person with a disability. So next slide. One of my favorite quotes as a scholar is from Janet Helms, and it resonated with me earlier in and still continues to do so today. Early in my research career as a queer person, I was really distraught. I was really frustrated by research done by heterosexual folks about the queer population, and I was really frustrated that they asked deficit-based questions. What they thought the problem was or the research focus should be maybe wasn't what I thought it should be as a queer person, and many of the folks who identified in the community that I feel like I belong to didn't often feel like we were represented quite well. And so that really struck me. And when I became a researcher myself, I came across this quote from Janet Helms that I really love, because she warned that if a researcher is unable to examine the effects of her or his own, and I would add their or here, own racial development, then the researcher really risks contributing to this existing body of racially oppressive literature rather than offering any illuminating scholarship. And as a white researcher, that really gave me pause, right? Because I could see how I was misrepresented or LGBTQ issues were misrepresented. And I would say that in my current work, the same holds true for scholars without disabilities who conduct research with people with disabilities. And so that this is always at the forefront of my mind, because as a qualitative researcher, I am the instrument, right? So next slide. So I'll tell you that in my research in general, I'm committed to collaborating with teams of experts with and without disabilities. All of my work and all of the published work that I'll talk about in a little bit about people with disabilities has been done in collaboration with other scholars who identify as people with disabilities or people with conditions that are disabling sometimes, depending on the environment. I'm constantly checking my own assumptions and biases, and actually Zeke does a really good job of helping me with that as one of my co-authors. I think that he's comfortable checking me, which I appreciate. I'm always working on my own cultural competency. I can't ask my students to do it if I'm not willing to do it myself. I'm also always interested in foregrounding this prevalence of ableism. I'm a critical scholar, and so these kind of ableism in addition to the other interlocking systems of oppression can't ever be far from my work, and it actually shapes everything I do and the way I think about the problem statement, the research questions, the things that I talk about, the ways I write my papers, those things. I'm also committed to rejecting deficit-laden perspectives about people with disabilities and focusing on strengths, resilience, and intersectionality whenever we can. I'm also really committed to honoring and centering student counter-narratives. And conducting research that informs practice. I never want to be the person who does scholarship for scholar's sake. I was a student affairs practitioner for a lot of years, and I want to do research that matters. And so it's always important when I do work to make sure that it's translatable and done in words that I can explain. I had a colleague just slide a paper across the table to me in a meeting about 2 days ago. And he said, "What do you think of this?" And I looked down, and the first 10 words were words that I would have had to look up in the dictionary, and that is not accessible. It may be scholarly and impressive to some people, but that's just not what I think is accessible and the kind of work that I want to do. So I'll take the next slide, please. So Zeke had given me a list of questions to think about in terms of this presentation. So instead of going back and forth, I kind of summarized them into a slide where you could read along or listen along, or print out, keep a copy, I think, for your records. That's fine with me. And then I'll open it up to questions. And so Zeke had asked me to talk a little bit about my research. So I'm going to do it by study. And so I've done 3 kind of major studies. And so I'll give you a little bit of sense about each of them, and then we'll do some questions and answers. I'd rather talk with you than at you. So the first study was actually a study of how diverse students developed a sense of belonging. And we recruited any students who self-identified themselves as a member of any minoritized social identity group, and they get to self-select in. It was a grounded theory study. We did 2 in-depth individual interviews, one in the fall and then a follow-up in the spring, because we believe that while we talk a lot about belonging in the first semester, we were interested in seeing how belonging kind of transformed from those first 6 weeks that we know are critical, but throughout the first year. We had 30 participants in the study, and 8 self-identified as people with disabilities, and you can actually see the entire paper in the Journal of College Student Development, and I'll show you the next slide, is the main model that we propose in the paper. And we talked about, students talked about kind of 3 pieces that really shape their sense of belonging. And belonging then in turn, because we did this over the course of the year, shaped some of these I don't want to call them factors, I'm not a quantitative researcher, but themes, and they kind of interacted with each other. So it's a lengthy paper, but just overall, the self-advocacy piece got at the notion that students really felt like they belonged on campus if they were successful at self-advocating inside and outside the classroom. So part of self-advocacy is knowing yourself and your strengths and your limits and the things that you need to do to be successful. And so it was everything from students knowing that kind of physical exercise was something that was going to get her through her exams and her studying, and so she joined the outing club. Others who, a student who was in a band, and so she had to have the sheets of music enlarged to be able to participate, and when she advocated for herself and asked for that, and those sheets were enlarged regularly on a regular basis, she felt like she belonged, and she belonged in the band. Our second is social relationships. This should be no shocker to those of us in student affairs, right? Friends, peer relationships, faculty relationships were important. Students also talked about not just kind of social relationships, but some more instrumental relationships with their RAs, with tutors, with study groups that really helped them be successful. And then the last piece was what we thought was kind of the new piece to the literature was we called it mastery. I was working with a colleague who has a psychology background, and she talked a lot about, we really started to see in student narratives the importance of mastery, and we called it mastery of the student role. We read a lot of literature about the implicit and the explicit messages that students with disabilities get about them not belonging in college, that they somehow aren't able to accomplish the same things that other students are. And so for students who felt like they belonged, they were able to kind of share this narrative that they were mastering the student role. And that meant in many ways that they were getting good grades, and I use air quotes for good grades. They felt like they were getting grades that were good. But far and above that, they felt like they were a quote unquote legitimate student, and they used that word. Some of them did, but they just wanted to feel like another student. So one student said, you know, I feel like I belong when I go to the local coffee shop and I sit down with my books and I do my work and I look around and I realize that I'm just like everybody else and I belong here. And so they were mastering this kind of student role. So I would encourage you to read the paper to kind of find about how these pieces kind of fit together, and how all those pieces were important. We often talk about belonging in terms of those social relationships, but these other pieces seem to be really important for our students. We can have the next slide. So I am someone who really believes in honoring not just student stories, but the fact that students spend a lot of time with qualitative researchers often. Some of these students spend an hour and a half or 2 hours in their first interview and an hour and a half or 2 hours in their second interview. Yeah, you had the right slide. You can move it forward. And they told us more than what is on this slide right here, this model. They told us lots of stories that were important. And so one of my frustrations as a scholar is that we take this enormous amount of data and really important stories that tell us, and students tell us that they think are all really important. And then as scholars, we have to pare them down into 25 pages for a manuscript. And that doesn't always feel great to me. And so it's always on my mind as I'm kind of analyzing data to think about what are the multiple stories students are telling us, because they are, and how do we share that with a broad audiences of educators and families and psychologists and counselors and students, other students. So how do we do that? And so from this particular study, it was a very small sample of 8 students, but they still told us another story that we thought was important to share. And so the second paper, you can see the citation at the bottom, was about how students learn to self-advocate. And they told us lots of really interesting stories about how they learn the actual skill of self-advocating, largely from family members and educators early in life. And then, you know, we talk about self-advocacy skills as if they all look the same. And so we heard students telling us stories about 3 different ways that they self-advocated. And the first was proactively. So the students, right, who take their accommodation letters to the faculty member on the very first day and say, I'm a student with a disability, here's my accommodation letter, this is what I need. Thank you very much, right? Proactive, first day, first week of classes. Then there were students who reactively self-advocated. So they didn't actually do that on the first day of class, or they didn't ask for what they needed. And then they didn't do so well on a test, or they felt like at midpoint they were struggling, and then they thought, okay, I need to self-advocate, right? Because I'm not doing so well in the moment. And so it was a reaction to realizing that they weren't as successful as that they hoped they would be. And then finally, we had students talk about retrospectively self-advocating. And these were students who said, I went through my fall semester and I didn't share the accommodation letters, or I did and the faculty ignored them and didn't give me the accommodations I needed, and I just didn't feel comfortable saying anything, and so I just tried to make it through. And maybe I didn't do as well as I wanted to in these classes. And it's now the spring semester, and I'm going to self-advocate differently now. So it was based on retrospection and kind of moving towards the future. So we thought that that was a really interesting way. We often talk very dualistically about whether or not students self-advocate or not. And there's such very rich and varied ways that students can do that. And so we hope that this paper kind of contributes to a richer conversation of that. And I'll help you move the next slide. Study 2 was with Zeke Kimball and Nadia Vargas, who is a student of Zeke's. And we were interested in how higher education professionals conceptualize their campus work with students with disabilities. And so it was a qualitative study with 31 participants from 21 higher education institutions across the Northeast. And we have 3 papers, well, 2.5, I suppose, 2 that have been published and 1 that says under review, but we were just notified yesterday as a revise and resubmit. So the first one is about kind of disability as diversity in terms of competency development in terms of practitioners. The second one is our grounded theory model of how student affairs professionals use kind of informal theory and their skills and competencies that they would use with lots of different diverse students to support students with disabilities, because often they weren't trained or had any education about disability topics or how to support specifically students with disabilities. And then our latest piece, we hope, will be about disability and campus housing. Of these 31 professionals, many of them either worked in housing or supervised housing because they were assistant deans or deans of students, or had been in housing at some point in their career, maybe just in their graduate program, and now they were in career services or student activities. But their narratives in terms of the specific challenges and successes and unique opportunities for student affairs professionals in campus housing really warranted its own paper. And so we hope that that will get out there in JSARC sometime soon. And then the next slide is my current study, again with Zeke Kimball, and also Peter Troiano from Central Connecticut State University. Nope, he's no longer at Central. Yes, he's at Central. He's an interim vice president right now, and he's also a faculty member. Adam Moore from the University of Rhode Island, whose expertise is in special ed. He's a K-12 educator. And Barbara Newman, who's a emeritus professor in human development and family studies, and many, many graduate students. And so this most recent study, our overarching questions are: how do college students with disabilities describe the process of developing a sense of purpose? Again, here's that connection for me between identity and student development. And how salient are student social identities, not just disability, but their race, their gender, their sexuality, their social class, as they develop a sense of purpose. And it was a multi-institutional study. Students from 4 different institutions in the Northeast participated in this grounded theory study. We did 59 in-depth individual interviews that ranged from anywhere from, I think, 45 minutes to almost 2 hours. And then we did 34 follow-up interviews with all students who we could still contact after. So then my next slide, I think, is my last slide. Nope, got 2 more. So who participated in the study? We didn't want students to feel like they had to self-select into a box. We can talk about labels. Labels are not great for everyone. There are medical labels, there are social identity labels, there are critical labels. And so we actually asked students to use their own words to describe their disability. They self-selected into the study based on flyers and emails through disability services offices that said anyone who self-identified as a person with disability or had a disability could volunteer for the study, and whether or not they were registered with disability services. We did put up flyers around campus. And so we asked students who self-selected into the study, in your own words, describe your disability. And so they wrote some really interesting things. A couple samples right here at the top of the slide: anxiety and memory issues. Another student said autistic, and a pile of things you could argue either are a part of autism or not. and another student said no use of my right arm. So we really wanted to give students kind of this sense of I can, if I choose to use a label or describe myself, I want to be able to have the agency to do that. And we were really proud of ourselves until we started writing these manuscripts, right? When journal reviewers wanted to categorize and they wanted to know who our sample really was, and how did they shake out in terms of categories that they were maybe used to reading. And so then we were forced to then go back to the student self-descriptions and try to categorize them into these oft-used categories. And these percentages don't add up to 100 because students often said that they had more than one disability. And so you can see the list from learning disability to other health impairments here on the slide. And when we did this, though, we actually looked back at the data and we mirror the college-going population of people with disabilities strikingly. Not exactly, but we were actually quite surprised that this volunteer students who participated in our study actually look a lot like the national population of students. So I wanted to share that with you. And then my last slide, this is truly my last slide. We have mountains, as you can imagine, mountains and mountains of data from all of those interviews, and so we spent almost 2 years analyzing the data multiple ways and multiple times, and I'm really glad to say that our first publication doesn't even have purpose in the title, not because that's a good thing in terms of research, but because what we wrote about was very strengths-based, and so we actually we were about done analyzing our data about the time that the Journal of Diversity in Higher Ed put out their special call for activism. And I don't believe that in the call for that special edition, they had a lot in terms of activism and race and gender and sexuality, but I don't even think the sample examples they gave of what they were looking for in terms of submissions included disability or not, but we knew we had students who told us lots of stories about activism, or at least what activism might have looked like to them. And that included self-advocacy, telling their stories to educate others about what disability was, about what ableism is, all of those sorts of things, and then collective action. And they engaged in collective action through student groups on some of their campuses, or through blogging, or through kind of social media. And so we were really excited that our first publication was about a really strengths-based look at students with disabilities redefining activism, because we often talk about it in a really narrow way. Our forthcoming publications, our main model of, so we're developmentalists in terms of this paper, we're taking the developmental perspective of what does the purpose development process look like for college students with disabilities. And it is in press finally after a year and a half in the Journal of College Student Development. So we're hoping in early 2018 that this publication will come out. We have another one on pathways to purpose that's a little more deep dive into the purpose development process, because as always, you can get a 30-page manuscript that covers very little of your data. We have 2 pieces on how students coped with discrimination and ableism. We also have a number of papers on intersectionality, again, deep dives into gender and sexuality intersections. We have a paper we just presented at ASH about the intersections of social class, which there's a lot of historical connections, right, for those of you who do this work, between social class and disability. And then hopefully a couple on career decision-making. And then we also have a piece that Zeke's doc student, brilliant doc student, is helping us shape in terms of maybe 1 or 2 papers on what microaggressions look like for college students with disabilities. So I think I covered everything that Zeke asked me to cover. So I'd love to engage in a conversation and have a dialogue about some things that you all want to talk about. Thank you.
So as I mentioned before, for the question process, if you'd like to submit questions through the question feature, or there should be an option for you to raise a hand, and then I will unmute your microphone, and you can feel free to speak at that point in time.
And so while we're waiting for folks to kind of jump in and ask some questions, I do have one follow-up question, and that's mostly around some of the implications of your work for practice. And so I'm wondering if you might frame this out in kind of two different ways. One is for the individual student affairs practitioner, working with an individual student, and then the other is for broader institutional policymaking. So what are some of the key insights that you've derived from your experience doing this?
Well, I'm not sure that I can separate my answers because they're probably going to be the same. First is stop looking at students through a deficit lens, because if the first thing we ask ourselves about students with disabilities is what can't they do or what accommodations they need, we don't see them as these activists, students who have amazing purpose journeys, a sense of belonging that was crafted through really interesting venues. And so I would say to individuals and institutional policymakers that whether or not you intended, I think most of the time what I see in my own practice and when I read a lot of the research is that we come at this research and our students with a very deficit lens, whether or not it's intentional or not. I think it's implicit bias is pretty real. And so we need to understand the literature, not just my research, but all the great research that's being done in the last few years in particular, the most recent stuff with folks, and then some of the classic literature that still holds true, right? So I can't help but note that Nancy Evans is on the call, right? So stuff that was written a decade, 2 decades ago is still relevant, and that's why I had to start out with we're still looking at people through a deficit lens, and ableism is still quite real in our everyday lives. And so I don't know if I answered your question, Zeke, but to read the research, but read it with a critical lens too. Sometimes I have to get up and walk away from the paper when I'm reading it because the researchers, whether they're intending to be really informative, but they're quite offensive, I think, sometimes.
Nancy, you're unmuted now.
Okay. Annemarie, I'm really curious a little bit about your research path, because in a lot of ways parallels my own, in that I actually started my research looking at LGBT students as a straight person, and then late in my career shifted to looking at students with disabilities, and I do identify as a person with disabilities. And you've kind of done that same thing first by later in your career, starting to look at students with disabilities as a person without a disability. You did it backwards for me.
Yeah,
anyway,
I did.
Yeah, anyway, I'm curious as to what brought you to the research on the students with disabilities, and what keeps you there?
Yeah, great. I'm happy to answer that. So I started with my dissertation was actually about women, so I identify as a feminist. I was brought up by a feminist, and so my early research was certainly me-search. I did a lot of work, and I continue to do work on LGBTQ students and queer students in particular. So that is still part of my research and my body of research, and it always will be. But how I got started was by listening. So my study that I mentioned, the first study that we published from the students, of students with, in terms of sense of belonging, the students who volunteered for the study and came and told us some really interesting and different stories than the rest of the sample really kind of made me think and pause. And my co-author is a woman who has a condition that is sometimes disabling, and so we talked a lot about that and how important it was to kind of share those stories. And then I met Zeke at a conference, and we talked about our research agendas, and we decided that we might want to do a little research together. And so we joined forces and started to think about what were the questions that weren't asked yet. And we partnered with some other folks So again, we have a team of people with and without disabilities. I would not have ever said, oh, I'm interested in this topic, so I'm going to study. I think that's, that just doesn't feel right to me as a critical scholar, because that becomes about forwarding my own career. So I joined partners with Zeke and colleagues, and the little hesitation that I had in terms of should I be doing this research mostly went away when we sent out our first call for participants for that study. And the recruitment email went through multiple institutions that will remain unnamed, right? And the volunteers were able to email us directly if they wanted to participate. And so I sent out that recruitment letter before I left for class at about 3:30 in the afternoon. And I was in class giving a presentation on my computer, and my emails were popping up as I was in class. And within 1 hour, 26 students with disabilities volunteered for the study.
Yeah.
And I thought, all right, these are students who want to tell their story.
Yes.
Right? And so I was just so honored that they wanted to share their story, and then in turn wanted to honor their story. And so that's what kind of keeps me going, is that as long as there are students who are minoritized in lots of different ways, we're writing these papers about the intersections of class and sexuality. We had a number of students who identified as LGBTQ in this particular study, that if they want to share their stories, that it's really important for me to get their stories out there to researchers and educators and scholars. And so if you look at my ridiculously long vita, the number of publications I do is I think 4 times as long as the number of presentations is 4 times as long as my publications, and that's intentional. I do a lot of presentations on campus, off campus, at local conferences, because I really believe that if students told me their stories and we found some interesting things that could help practitioners, it's my duty to get it out there and really help inform practice. So that's why I do what I do, and that's why I continue. This is a really long answer to a question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's very interesting and very much along my thinking too. I've never did any LGBT work without partners that were members of the community. And I feel the same way about working with students with disabilities, is that I think it's important for those of us that have disabilities, one, to be doing some research, and two, to be informing those we work with when they're not on track too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, okay, I will let others ask questions. I have others, but go ahead.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. And, I would also add that, that's also when we think about doing research as a member of a community or not, and I identify as part of the queer community, but identify as queer and bisexual, and that doesn't mean that I'm not going to misgender trans participants. Doesn't mean that I'm not going to be offensive to other members of the within group, right, within my own group, and so it's real complicated. And I think it's a big responsibility for any researcher doing any kind of research with minoritized populations, whether you're in or out group, that there's always cultural competency work for us to keep doing on ourselves. So thanks.
So Nancy, no one else has submitted questions at all, so if you have any other questions, feel free to proceed.
Okay, thank you. I'm really interested in the last study that you mentioned, well, for many, many reasons, and it's so fascinating to have that much data and be able to ask so many questions of it. But my research team has currently in the middle of data collection for a study looking at how students negotiate residence life settings in small private colleges. So it will be interesting to look at what your student affairs practitioners have to say about that in comparison to what our students have to say about living there. Have you gotten far enough along that you can talk at all about what they're saying?
Sure. We spent a lot of the paper talking about this, practitioners talking about this kind of push and pull, this tension between meeting the needs of individual students with disabilities through accommodations, through single rooms, through comfort animals, through service animals, through peanut-free environments, through personal care attendants having access to a room, and the needs and the frustrations and the limited perspectives of the rest of the community, and how that could be a real challenge. And so, you know, one of the striking examples in the paper, I'll give a little hint at, one of the really most, and then kind of some of the challenges between students, and negotiating those challenges. So, so this kind of community/student view of the world is, you know, they talked about one student wanting the whole residence hall to be peanut free, and they're like, well, you can't ask the world to be peanut free, so how are we gonna make this realistic? So your roommate can't have peanut butter, but you can't ask 300 other people to not have it. And then what happens when relationships go wrong? And so one of the students who was allergic to peanuts had some friends and relationships, and then they went wrong, and they were having some trouble, and the students thought it was interesting. It would be within their right, and it would be funny to soak their hands in peanut oil and touch things all over the building. Yeah. And so the student got sent to the hospital quite a few times. And so they talked about this kind of, how do we navigate this tension between meeting individual student needs, holding the community accountable. We can't inform the community of a student's disability or their accommodation for privacy reasons and confidentiality reasons, yet they see the student has a pet, or the student gets a single room. So, right, they see them as privileges, or I don't want some personal care attendant, some stranger, quote unquote, right, coming into my room. So we kind of wrestle with that in the paper. So this individual versus community. And I'll let Zeke jump in. Zeke was the lead on this study, and so it feels a little awkward to talk about a study that Zeke was really, it was even his idea to begin with. And so Zeke, if you want to jump in, please.
No, you did a great job. I couldn't summarize it better.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it was interesting. The paper had gotten feedback the first time around from, you know, well, we want to know what the students think, and we're like, well, that wasn't our population, right? We were taking it from a practitioner point of view, but they had such rich stories that we could kind of garner what, you know, where some of the students were coming from in terms of them saying, I don't want this in my room, or I don't believe this is fair, or whatever it is. But I can't wait to see these pieces of work side by side, because I think we only have part of the picture for sure. Yeah.
Sorry, I can't help myself. I do have one thing to add. In our second round of disability and purpose interviews, we did actually ask some intentional questions about living environments, and how students with disabilities had experienced residence halls, why they had made the decisions that they had to move off campus, those sorts of things. And oftentimes what we found in speaking with students with disabilities was that their experiences reaffirmed what we would have thought their experiences were, based upon what student affairs practitioners were sharing. So student affairs practitioners were sharing how very difficult they found to successfully navigate the needs of students with disabilities and the needs of an inclusive community. And students with disabilities were very consistently saying, yeah, it's really hard to be a student with a disability in a college residence hall. And so some of what students with disabilities shared was even far more nuanced than what student affairs practitioners were thinking through. So for example, a student with ADHD expressing the fact that they felt it was fundamentally unfair that there were other people in the residence hall who could simply study anywhere. They could go to the TV room and study while the TV was blaring. But when they asked for a quiet space in the residence hall, it didn't have to be their room, it didn't have to be the common area that everybody else was in, but just a quiet space. They were told, no, it didn't meet community needs. And so that's an angle that a student with a disability could share that a student affairs practitioner wouldn't necessarily think about, because they were much more concerned with the kind of extreme outliers.
Yeah.
Like students trying to give another student anaphylactic shock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or a service dog that had cancer and needed treatment, right? So this giant service dog was scaring people, but was also getting sick in the hallways and classrooms. And So we actually took a kind of an ecological view of that paper in terms of residence halls, because while the paper was inherently about what happened in the residence halls, we made the argument that these students were also in other campus spaces where these things were relevant, right? So the student who had the allergies was then going to the health center or missing class because of it, right? So this is all interconnected. And we don't often talk about that. We talk about partnerships all the time in student affairs, but we've been talking about it since I was a young professional, and I don't think we've mastered that quite yet.
Right. Yeah. We have a current paper that is just about to go into JCSD, submit, not publish, unfortunately. But a lot of the things that you were just saying parallel what the students in this earlier study were saying around reactions of others and moving off campus because of the reactions of others, and just wanting a space where they felt they could be themselves and do what they needed to do for themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Look forward to it.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in. I actually have a question or two myself. I was curious in your research and sort of your sort of practice in this area or whatnot, whether you felt there were some differences in attitude regarding whose job it was to work with students with disabilities, and maybe some, I guess some tangible, not necessarily outcomes, but tangible points that you've taken from your research that may indicate, if there is some sort of discrepancy in how people feel, who should handle those concerns. I hate to use the word handle, but
yeah. Well, so I'm gonna let Zeke jump in as you'd like. I think I'm going to start with the student perspectives. We have a whole enormous subpile of data about what students say their perspective of professionals or the university is, and that is that the disability services and or the education or the development or the support that they received is incredibly siloed. That different departments don't talk to one another, and then they get well, no, you have to, sorry that you one student broke her femur, and so no, disability services can help you. Try parking services, but parking services across campus, and how do I get on the bus? How do I get over the snowbank to get on the bus to get over there? But then my classes are in there, so I just need a temporary parking pass so that I can get to my classes on the other side of campus. Oh, but that's not us, that's another, right? And so students felt like we didn't have our act together. And I say we broadly in terms of higher ed, in terms of everyone seeming to point the student to different offices of whose job it was, and almost never was theirs, or they had a very small piece of responsibility that they were willing to take a responsibility for. I would say the professionals in our study, the ones who self-selected into our study, we did focus groups at a conference, and so people who self-selected into that study were clearly people who didn't think that it was only the job of people in disability services to work with students with disabilities. And if they had, they probably would not have come to our session to share their experiences and hear the experiences of others. And so in some ways, it was a little bit of a kind of an interesting sample in terms of their perspectives. But they did talk about their capacity to think about what their job was and what their limitations were in terms of, okay, the person in housing says, I can think about this, but then I also have to work with the health center, and then I also maybe need to work with the counseling center, and I also need to think about academics and what that looks like. And so they often felt like they had to reach out to individuals and use those individual connections they had on campus to actually get the students the support that they really needed. The couple examples that we talk about in the papers of, I would say, the most successful or the places that people wanted to get was to have kind of interdepartmental teams of people who didn't just react when there was a crisis, but people from all different student affairs and academic affairs departments that would meet regularly to talk about not just supporting particular students with disabilities, but also talking about, in general, how do we be proactive on our campus to make it more of an inclusive place for everyone. So before we have an issue in housing, or before we have an issue with accessibility with our buses, before we have an issue in the classroom, what are some things we can do? What are some trainings we can do for all of our faculty and staff? So those are kind of the ideal, and a couple of campuses had interdepartmental teams that did function that way, but they were largely reactionary, but they talked about the ideal being them much more proactive. And so I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think so.
Zeke, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think the only other thing that I would say is one of the things that emerged very consistently is the idea that folks were feeling radically underprepared. Mm-hmm. So in most master's level preparation programs for student affairs professionals, there's very little content related to disability. And so unless you end up in a very specialized assistantship or you end up pursuing disability services as a career path, the opportunities to receive training specifically related to the support needs of students with disabilities are limited. And then beyond that, the theoretical frameworks that we provide student affairs professionals to think about student experiences oftentimes don't systematically interrogate issues of disability. And that's not to say that people with disabilities are solely their disability. It's simply to say that if we're constructing models that do a really good job thinking about multiple social identities, but we don't include disability, then we're socializing generations of student affairs professionals not to think about disability at the forefront of their work, but rather to think about it in a reactionary manner. And so the folks that we talked with were very clear that that was a limitation of their training and a perspective that they were really proactively working to overcome.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think my other question would sort of be more of a practical, practice-based one. So for, I know we have a couple actual practitioners on the call today, and I know for some areas and for some individuals, particularly my office, we are very much interested in doing some of this research and developing literature on it, so that on this topic of disability in higher education and students with disabilities, so that we can push the field forward and sort of be the thought leaders on this particular area. I was curious if you had seen, if in your work or whatnot, you had seen anything regarding longitudinal tracking students over time. I know that we've had some particular concerns generally about where we sit in terms of our own research with our students, what information we use, ADA concerns, things like that. So just as a practical comment, I know that you're not, legal representation, so you can't necessarily make, an actual recommendation, but I was curious if you saw any examples of longitudinal research out there. What generally is the sort of methodology for many of these studies? How do they approach researching on disability in higher education, and particularly students with disabilities?
Wow. Zeke, do you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure, I can try. So there is some work out there. Oftentimes it doesn't necessarily emerge from higher education scholars, but rather from folks who are doing work in rehabilitation counseling or psychology. And some of that work uses what's called a within-subject design, so essentially looking at changes in experience and outcomes over time for the same individual. Those tend to be smaller sample sizes, but also quantitative work. There is also quantitative work that makes use of existing national data sets, so things like ELS, the Educational Longitudinal Study of 2002, BPS, the Beginning Post-Secondary Study, HSLS, the High School Longitudinal Study, things like that, that will allow you to look at changes over time within a population, and those tend to be the sorts of data sets that are more well represented in higher education journals. Additionally, we're starting to see a little bit of traction from journals and also from funders who recognize that when we're working with students with disabilities who are a relatively hard to reach population, particularly when we're talking about students with disabilities who don't self-identify to disability services, but also within certain diagnoses, there being relatively few students with that particular diagnosis on a campus, that it may not be appropriate to always use quantitative instrumentation to look at longitudinal change. And so funders and journal editors have started to be a bit more accepting of qualitative work that looks at change over time. And so you're starting to see that a little bit as well. And actually one of the faculty members at Florida State, Brad Cox, is doing some of that work with students with autism, looking at their experiences over time. So I think that all those things are hopeful in being able to map changes in student experience over time, and then also the outcomes of students with disabilities. I would say, from a legal perspective, again, as Annemarie mentioned, neither of us are legal scholars. Some of those concerns are simply a way of deflecting the fact that the institution doesn't want to ask difficult questions about itself. So some of it might be they're concerned about what the outcomes for students with disabilities truly look like. So for example, here at UMass, we recently did a climate survey, and we're absolutely shocked to find out that students with disabilities have a very negative experience of our campus climate. Who would have thought? And there was much hand-wringing over that particular outcome, even though it surprised almost no one on campus who had ever thought about students with disabilities, right? So there's that, just not wanting to look at what the actual outcomes and experiences are. There's also the fact that when we ask questions like, can we legally do this, it often entails looking at collaboration between registrars' offices and disability services offices, and institutional research, learning outcomes assessment, and sometimes departments, and kind of combining and mixing data in ways that are complicated and relatively atypical for us. And so sometimes we use well, the ADA won't let us do it, or FERPA says we can't, as a pretense for simply saying we don't want to actually do the work to figure out what would be required to do this well. Because I've yet to see a convincing case that we couldn't overcome those FERPA obstacles or those ADA obstacles if we actually cared enough to do so.
Thanks, Zeke.
I think one of the things I would add to that is from our own work in terms of qualitative work, where we talk to students twice, and sometimes there was a little more than over a year in between the times we interviewed them, and many students talked about their quote-unquote diagnoses changing, or realizing that they had a second disability when maybe most of their life they had thought they only had one. And we had a lot of students either leave the university or not respond the first time, and so kind of following students over time is challenging in lots of ways anytime you do research, but these were kind of interesting hurdles for us to kind of get over. So we did, 59 interviews the first time and 37, I have to look at the numbers, the second time 34, the second time, and it's not because we only invited 34, it's because we could only get a hold of, and 34 only said yes. So it's challenging, right?
And so that's actually a pretty good note to end on. It's challenging. if you have any questions that occur to you after the presentation, do feel free to let one of us know, and we'll do our best to get them to Annemarie and to get you answers as well. We do hope that you'll keep an eye out for upcoming presentations in the Research Roundtable series. And if you have any suggestions about who you might want to hear from next, do please let us know that as well. But otherwise, thank you so much, Annemarie, for sharing your expertise and experience with us today. And thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. It was nice to meet you all. Have a great day.
Thanks so much.